Well, thank you very much, Britta. It is a pleasure to be here and to be able to participate in the GROMADA Lecture series. I will first of all see if I am able to share my PowerPoint presentation with all of you. Okay, so as Britta mentioned at the outset, I will be speaking today about the right healthy environment in situations of armed conflict. And for those of you who maybe attended the lecture also in the GROMADA series by Ambassador Marie Jacobson, you may find some of the concepts in this lecture familiar as well, in particular perhaps the International Law Commission's principles on the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, which I will be speaking about a little bit during this lecture. But to begin, I wanted to say a few words about the interlinkages between human rights and environment more generally, and the tendencies that we have seen as of late with the examples here from the UN human rights mechanisms, with these issues being more and more integrated, and the UN human rights mechanisms and also regional human rights mechanisms, I should say, more and more looking at the different ways that climate change, environmental degradation, and environmental harm can have an effect on the effective enjoyment of human rights. And some example of these are, for instance, the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, which is an independent expert appointed by the Human Rights Council that analyzes human rights obligations of states through this environmental lens, and also looking specifically at the right to healthy environment. In addition to the Special Rapporteur on Environment and Human Rights, there are many other of these independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council, so human rights independent experts that have increasingly discussed and analyzed in their thematic reports and their country analysis how environmental harm and environmental degradation impacts the thematic issues that they are looking at. So one example is, for instance, the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, the Special Rapporteur on right to water, the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. All of these and many, many other independent experts, working groups, and special rapporteurs are increasingly looking at this connection between human rights and environment. We also see a similar tendency in the Universal Periodic Review, which is where states review each other's human rights records and provide recommendations. And up until April of this year, there are more than 800 recommendations that states have given to each other that in different ways allude to environment or climate change. And I should say that the majority of these recommendations have also been accepted by the state in question that has received the recommendation. We also see that the human rights treaty bodies, so the committees that are established to safeguard and monitor the effective enjoyment of human rights under their respective core human rights conventions. So one example, for instance, being the Human Rights Committee that looks at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Committee on the Rights of the Child that looks at the Convention on the Rights of the Child and how states and other actors are living up to their obligations under these treaties. These treaty bodies have also increasingly been looking at environment and human rights. And you see a few examples here in the slide from the Human Rights Committee that I just mentioned that looks at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that has had a few cases before it regarding climate change, environmental harm, and human rights. And also the Committee on the Rights of the Child that has issued a dedicated general comment so guidance to states on how they should understand their obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child in relation to the environment, with a specific focus on climate change. Against all of this sort of background of the interlinkages between human rights and environment and the increased focus by the UN human rights mechanisms, we then in October 2021 had a Human Rights Council resolution, Resolution 4813, recognizing the right to healthy environment. And this was a resolution that was adopted by the Council. There were 4 abstentions, but no votes against the right, which is important in its own right to note. The resolution, a few sort of maybe comments on what the resolution entails that recognizes this right. It recalls sustainable development and sustainable development goals that we have in place since 2015 and serve as a standard for the international community. The resolution talks, and here again we see the linkages between the human rights fora and the international environmental fora. It talks about the importance of implementing multilateral environmental agreements and principles of international environmental law. It talks in general terms about the risks and threats of environmental degradation on human rights and mentions specifically the right to life as an example of this. And finally, the resolution invites the General Assembly to consider the matter. So as you may know, the Human Rights Council is represented by 47 different states that are elected by the General Assembly, but not all UN member states serve at the Human Rights Council at the same time. And then in July of 2022, we had General Assembly Resolution 76-300, which also recognized the right to healthy environment. And now in this broader setting of the full General Assembly. Again, we can see this reference to multilateral environmental agreements and the importance of the principles of international environmental law, which we'll come back to a little bit later during this lecture as well. Interestingly, in the resolution here, there's also an emphasis on gender equality and rights of women. And the resolution also calls in general for international cooperation, capacity building, and sharing of good practices. So if we now have acknowledged that the right to healthy environment was recognized by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, and it comes against this background of increased focus on the interlinkages between human rights and environmental protection over a number of years, what does then this right consist of? So what are the elements of the right? And the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment has indicated the following substantive and procedural elements, and has also developed a number of analytical reports that focuses on these specific different elements. And they are safe climate, healthy air. There's a lot of discussion on air pollution, for instance, in relation to both of these reports. Healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. And here perhaps we see a link back to the reference to multilateral environmental agreements, such as, for instance, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the importance of that convention here. Safe and sufficient water, healthy food, and a non-toxic environment. And of course, there's also an independent expert or special rapporteur looking at toxics and human rights, and the report on non-toxic environment is developed in collaboration between these two special rapporteurs. So in addition to these substantive elements, there are also procedural elements, and they include the right to access to information, meaningful participation, and access to justice, which is sometimes also called access to remedies. And these three elements or pillars also overlap with some of the environmental democracy conventions. So for instance, the Aarhus Convention in Europe and beyond, which we will talk about a little bit more in this lecture, but also, for instance, in the Inter-American system, the Escazú Agreement, that similarly focuses on these three pillars of environmental democracy or environmental rights. So the right to access to information, meaningful participation, and access to justice. In terms of the situation in the Ukraine, there is a right in national legislation to a clean and safe environment. And this is a formulation that also comes across in other pieces of national legislation as well. It is one of the good practices that is mentioned by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment in his compilation of the situation for the right to healthy environment in nations across the globe as well. The right to a safe and clean environment was also interestingly referenced in the recent report by the high-level working group on the environmental consequences of war, the report that is entitled An Environmental Compact for Ukraine. And in this report, there's a reference noting that violations of the right to a healthy environment should in fact be investigated as part of international human rights investigations in the Ukraine more generally. So there's a reference to the right specifically in the Environmental Compact. There's also references to environmental due diligence and business and human rights, which we'll come back to later during the presentation as well. Importantly, at the regional level, the Ukraine is also state party to the Aarhus Convention. So this convention that I mentioned briefly just earlier, which is often referenced as an environmental democracy convention that has these three pillars of access to justice, meaningful participation, and access to information. And the Aarhus Convention starts with its Article 1 noting that the convention seeks to contribute to the protection of the right of every person of present and future generations to live in an environment adequate to his or her health and well-being. So here again, we see an important anchor of the right to healthy environment at the regional level for which the Ukraine is a state party. In terms of also at the regional level and through the membership within the Council of Europe and being a party to the European Convention on Human Rights, as part of the decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, we've seen a number of cases, again, focusing on this interlinkage between environment and human rights, and increasingly also climate change and human rights, that specifically take as its legal basis or legal foundation Article 2 regarding the right to life. And you can see an example of one of these environmental cases on the slide here, as well as Article 8 regarding the right to private and family life. So these two articles have often been used as a foundation to establish this connection between the obligations and rights under the European Convention on Human Rights and environmental concerns. So now we've spoken a little bit about what the right to healthy environment is, what are the elements that make up the right, how have different UN human rights mechanisms grappled with these connections, and what does the situation look like in terms of the different treaties and conventions that also apply to the Ukraine. And I wanted to now go a little bit deeper into these draft principles of the International Law Commission regarding protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts. And these principles, which some of you who listened to an earlier GROMADA lecture series may well already know, they were adopted by the International Law Commission in 2022. They were taken note of by the UN General Assembly in that same year. And interestingly, only recently were also taken note of again in a dedicated resolution by the UN Environment Assembly, which I will come back to a little bit later in this lecture as well. The principles look at protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict broadly. They look both at general principles, principles applicable also before armed conflicts. They look at the situation during armed conflicts, after armed conflicts, and in situations of occupation. In relation to the connection to human rights and the right to healthy environment, there's a dedicated reference in the preamble to the principles, noting the importance of the environment for livelihoods and the enjoyment of human rights. There's also references in the commentary that seeks to further define and explain the different principles to the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And for our purposes today, I also wanted to mention a few words about draft principle 10, which speaks about ensuring due diligence with respect to the protection of the environment when acting in an area affected by an armed conflict. And this links to this duty of the state to ensure this due diligence also in relation to corporate behavior and ensuring corporate accountability, also maps with some of the tendencies that we see, for instance, in the EU with the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is being discussed still at the moment, as well as several examples of national legislation, for instance, in France, and Germany, and Switzerland, that in different ways look at these different intersections of human rights and environment and ensuring due diligence across the supply chain, either in relation to specific thematic areas, such as child labor, for instance, or looking at specific minerals, such as, for instance, the EU Conflict Minerals Regulation, which looks at gold and the free teas. And in fact, the report of the high-level working group, the Compact, also reference the importance of ensuring human rights and environmental due diligence when planning the reconstruction and recovery for Ukraine, and also suggests the development of a national action plan on business and human rights, and that human rights and environmental due diligence should be an important element of this work. I also wanted to say a few words about environmental human rights defenders. And one of the reasons that I think it's particularly pertinent to talk about them in relation to the right to healthy environment in situations of armed conflict is that several studies and analysis, including by the UN Human Rights Mechanism, such as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Human Rights Defenders, have noted that environmental human rights defenders are particularly vulnerable as a subset of human rights defenders, and also that they are particularly vulnerable when operating in conflict or crisis-affected areas. And the focus on environmental defenders or environmental human rights defenders has also increased over the last number of years, including through this dedicated resolution, again by the Human Rights Council in 2019, which urges states to take necessary measures to ensure their rights. And we also see in the Human Rights Council resolution that recognized the right to healthy environment in 2021, that there's also a reference to the importance of protecting environmental human rights defenders. And here the linkage is also made between the protection of environmental defenders and ensuring that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and the corporate responsibility to respect human rights together with the state duty to protect human rights is fulfilled in a meaningful way. As mentioned, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders already in 2016 mentioned the specific importance of protecting environmental human rights defenders, and that mandate, together with other special rapporteurs, have since gone on to continue highlighting the importance of this protection, including using also this 2019 dedicated resolution by the Council on Environmental Defenders, as well as referring to the recognition of the right to healthy environment and the importance of environmental defenders in promoting this right as well. The Aarhus Convention, again, that I mentioned earlier, this environmental democracy treaty that Ukraine is also party to, has a dedicated article, Article 3.8, which focuses on ensuring that anyone who works for promoting the environment, or whistleblowers or the like, are protected from any kind of persecution or harassment. So this also already exists as an obligation for all state parties under the Aarhus Convention. And in fact, the Aarhus Convention went even further just a few years ago and established a dedicated special rapporteur on environmental defenders as part of a rapid response mechanism for the protection of environmental defenders. And this mandate was established in 2021, and Michel Faust was appointed as special rapporteur in 2022, and he has previously served as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders as part of this Human Rights Council protection of human rights system. And as mentioned, it has been noted by many different actors from within and across and beyond the UN system that environmental human rights defenders are often particularly vulnerable in conflict zones. And this can, for instance, be in relation to land rights in conflict or crisis-affected contexts. And that can also relate to, for instance, ensuring that there's proper information and documentation in relation to land, that there are meaningful consultation when anything happens in relation to planning of said land, and also that there's access to justice and remedies for any violations that have taken place. Before closing, I also wanted to say a few things about the United Nations Environment Assembly. So I started this lecture and presentation talking a bit about how the UN human rights mechanisms have in different ways engaged on this interlinkage between human rights and environment, of course, from the perspective of their mandate to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And I also then wanted to close with sort of the environment side of things. And here we see from 2016 onwards that we've had 3 dedicated resolutions that speak about protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts in different ways. And all of them refer to the importance of human rights and human rights standards, norms, and principles. So the very first resolution from 2016 also at the time calls for the continued collaboration with the International Law Commission, which was at the time still working on developing these principles on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts. And the resolution notes that it is recognized that sustainable development and the protection of the environment contribute to human well-being and the enjoyment of human rights. That same formulation then comes up again in a resolution from 2017, which again requests that the executive director, so the head of the UN Environment Programme, should continue this interaction and collaboration with the International Law Commission. And very recently, from the UNEA earlier this year, we have another resolution on environmental assistance and recovery in areas affected by armed conflict. And here we have both a reference to the International Law Commission's principle, and again, recommending that states make use of these, take note of them, distribute them, and use them effectively. And the resolution also urges states to adhere to rules of international law, including human rights law, in relation to protection of the environment in areas affected by armed conflict. So to summarize, the right to healthy environment has been increasingly recognized, discussed, and now recognized at the international level through the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. More than 80% of states around the globe also have, in one way or another, recognized this right through national legislation, judicial decisions, being part of regional treaties such as the Aarhus Convention or similar. And we see an increased focus also as part of the Aarhus Convention, as well as the European Convention on Human Rights and the work of the European Court on Human Rights at the European level. In terms of the interlinkages with the work of the International Law Commission and the principles on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, there's perhaps a particularly strong link in relation to the demands on due diligence and corporate responsibility and accountability. And here I think it's again interesting to note that the report of the high-level working group both refers to the importance of the right to a safe, healthy environment, as well as the importance of ensuring human rights and environmental due diligence when planning for recovery and reconstruction. So I think I will stop there and look very much forward to the questions.